The rain drummed against the windows of the old Victorian house where Margaret Hayes had spent her final years, each drop seeming to echo the weight of secrets that would soon unravel 2 lives forever. Inside, her grandsons David and Thomas sat in the mahogany-paneled study, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the fireplace, as the family lawyer cleared his throat and began reading the will that would change everything. Margaret Hayes had been more than a grandmother to them. She had been their anchor after their parents died in a car accident when David was 16 and Thomas was 18. The elegant woman with silver hair and kind eyes had opened her home and her heart, raising them with the gentle firmness of someone who understood that love sometimes meant saying no, and wisdom often came wrapped in the warm embrace of unconditional acceptance. Now, at 92, she was gone, leaving behind not just memories but a substantial inheritance that reflected a lifetime of careful investments and prudent financial decisions. The house itself was worth nearly $2 million, situated in one of the city's most prestigious neighborhoods. Beyond that, there were stocks, bonds, and savings accounts that brought the total estate to just over $4 million. To my beloved grandsons, David and Thomas, the lawyer read, his voice steady and professional. I leave my entire estate to be divided equally between you both. You have been the light of my twilight years, and I trust that you will honor not just my memory, but each other, as you navigate this inheritance together. David, now 34 and working as a high school teacher, felt tears well up in his eyes. The inheritance meant security he had never known, the possibility of paying off his student loans, maybe even buying a small house of his own. Thomas, 36 and working in finance, maintained his composure, though his mind was already calculating the possibilities that $4 million could provide. What David didn't know was that Thomas had been struggling with a secret that had been consuming him for years. The polished exterior of a successful financial advisor masked a devastating gambling addiction that had already cost him his marriage, his own savings, and nearly his career. The late-night poker games that had started as harmless fun with colleagues had evolved into high-stakes casino visits, online betting, and eventually, desperate attempts to chase losses with increasingly risky wagers. As the lawyer explained the legal processes that would need to be completed, Thomas's mind was racing. He had debts that David couldn't even imagine, creditors who were growing impatient, and a lifestyle that required constant infusions of cash just to maintain the illusion of success. The inheritance wasn't just an opportunity for him. It was a lifeline. The estate will need to go through probate, the lawyer continued. But as joint executors, you'll both have access to the accounts once the proper documentation is filed. I'll have everything ready for your signatures by next week. David nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. $2 million. It seemed impossible, like a dream that might evaporate if he thought about it too hard. He looked at his brother, expecting to see the same mixture of grief and gratitude that he was feeling. But Thomas's expression was unreadable, his eyes focused on something beyond the rain-streaked windows. That night, they stayed in their grandmother's house, neither wanting to be alone with their thoughts. David wandered through the rooms, touching the familiar objects that held so many memories. The piano where Margaret had taught him to play simple melodies, the kitchen table where she had helped him with homework, the garden where she had shown him how to tend roses and understand that beautiful things required patience and care. Thomas, meanwhile, was making phone calls in the privacy of the guest bedroom. His most pressing creditor was expecting $50,000 by the end of the week, and the casino where he had accumulated his largest debt was no longer accepting his promises of future payment. The inheritance was his salvation, but probate could take months, and he didn't have months. By morning, Thomas had formulated a plan that would haunt both brothers for years to come. He had access to their grandmother's accounts as joint executor, and he convinced himself that he would simply borrow what he needed and pay it back before David ever knew it was missing. It was a temporary solution, he told himself, a way to buy time until the estate was properly settled. But addiction has a way of transforming temporary solutions into permanent catastrophes. What started as a $50,000 withdrawal to satisfy his most urgent creditor quickly escalated. Each bet was going to be the one that would let him pay everything back with interest. Each card game was going to be the night he finally turned his luck around. Each spin of the roulette wheel was going to be the moment his fortunes changed forever. David, trusting his brother completely, signed whatever documents Thomas presented to him, never questioning the complexity of the legal processes or the necessity of various financial transfers. When Thomas explained that certain investments needed to be liquidated to avoid tax penalties, David nodded and signed. When Thomas said that the house needed to be sold quickly to take advantage of a favorable market, David agreed, even though it broke his heart to see their grandmother's home go to strangers. Months passed, and David began to worry about the delays in receiving his inheritance. Thomas always had explanations. Complications with the probate court, issues with the tax authorities, problems with the investment accounts. David's teacher salary barely covered his basic expenses, and he had been counting on the inheritance to finally achieve some financial stability. The truth began to unravel on a Tuesday afternoon when David received a call from a casino in Atlantic City. They were looking for Thomas, who had apparently given David's number as an emergency contact. The caller mentioned a substantial debt, figures that made David's hands shake as he wrote them down. That evening, David confronted his brother in the small apartment Thomas had moved to after selling what David now realized was his own half of their grandmother's house. The man who answered the door was a shadow of the polished financial advisor David had known all his life. Thomas's clothes were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands trembled as he tried to explain the unexplainable. "I was going to pay it back," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had a system, a strategy. I just needed a little more time to make it work." David listened in growing horror as Thomas confessed to everything. The entire inheritance was gone, lost in a maze of casinos, poker rooms, and online betting sites. The house, the investments, the savings accounts, all of it had been fed into the insatiable appetite of Thomas's addiction. $4 million, David said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Our grandmother's entire life's work, everything she saved for us, everything she wanted us to have to build our futures. It's all gone." Thomas collapsed into a chair, his face in his hands. "I know what I've done. I know I've destroyed everything. But I'm sick, David. This addiction, it's like a demon that controls everything I do. I never meant for it to go this far." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound David had ever experienced. This wasn't just about money, though the financial devastation was crushing. This was about trust, about family, about the sacred bond between brothers who had survived their parents' death together and had been raised by a grandmother who had taught them that family was everything. David left that night without saying another word, and for the next 3 years, he refused to take Thomas's calls, ignored his letters, and avoided any place where they might accidentally encounter each other. The inheritance that should have provided security instead left David with a devastating sense of loss that went far beyond the financial implications. Thomas, meanwhile, spiraled deeper into his addiction. Without the buffer of the inheritance money, his debts became unmanageable. He lost his job, his apartment, and eventually found himself living in a series of homeless shelters and cheap motels. The addiction that had cost him everything continued to drive him to seek out any opportunity to gamble, even when he had nothing left to lose. It was during his second stint in a court-ordered rehabilitation program that Thomas finally began to understand the true magnitude of what he had done. The therapy sessions, the group meetings, the slow and painful process of acknowledging his addiction forced him to confront not just his gambling problem, but the web of lies and betrayals that had supported it. He wrote letters to David that he never sent, practiced apologies that seemed inadequate, and gradually began to build a foundation of sobriety that was fragile but real. The program taught him that addiction was a disease, but it was not an excuse. He had made choices, and those choices had destroyed not just his own life, but the life of the brother who had trusted him completely. 3 years after that devastating confrontation, Thomas stood outside the elementary school where David now worked as a principal. He had been clean for 8 months, the longest period of sobriety he had achieved since his addiction began. He looked different, thinner, older, but with a clarity in his eyes that had been absent for years. David was locking up the school building when he saw his brother standing by the parking lot. The sight of Thomas sent a jolt of anger and pain through his chest, emotions he thought he had learned to manage through therapy and time. "David," Thomas said, his voice uncertain, "I know I don't have the right to ask for your time, but I need to say something to you." David stood frozen, torn between the impulse to walk away and the curiosity about what his brother could possibly say that would matter after all this time. "I've been in recovery," Thomas continued, his words carefully chosen. 8 months clean. I know that doesn't undo what I did, and I know it doesn't give you back what I stole from you. But I need you to know that I understand now what I took from you. It wasn't just money, David. I took your trust, your security, your inheritance from the woman who raised us. I took your future. David felt tears beginning to form, a mixture of anger and a grief that had never fully healed. Do you have any idea what these 3 years have been like for me? Do you understand that I'm still paying off credit card debt from trying to cover the expenses I thought the inheritance would handle? Do you know that I had to give up the idea of buying a house, of having any kind of financial security? Thomas nodded, his own tears flowing freely now. I know, and I know that saying I'm sorry isn't enough. I know that being sorry doesn't fix what I broke. But I needed you to know that I think about what I did every single day. I think about grandmother, about how disappointed she would be. I think about you, about the brother who trusted me completely, and I live with the knowledge that I betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. The conversation that followed was painful, raw, and honest in a way that neither brother had experienced since they were children. Thomas spoke about the progression of his addiction, the way it had slowly consumed his ability to make rational decisions, the desperate rationalizations that had allowed him to justify each theft from their shared inheritance. David talked about the impact of the betrayal, the way it had shattered his faith not just in his brother, but in his own judgment. He described the sleepless nights, the financial stress, the sense of having lost not just his inheritance, but his only remaining family member. I used to think about what grandmother would want, David said, his voice steady despite the tears. Would she want me to forgive you? Would she want me to try to understand that addiction is a disease? Or would she want me to protect myself from someone who had proven they couldn't be trusted? Thomas had no answer for that question, and both brothers sat in silence as the sun began to set behind the school building. I don't know if I can forgive you, David said finally. I don't know if I want to, but I need you to know that I'm glad you're getting help. I'm glad you're trying to get better. Not for me, but for you. Because the brother I grew up with was a good person who got lost somewhere along the way. Thomas looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in years. Does that mean there's a chance we could try to be brothers again someday? David was quiet for a long moment, weighing the complexity of forgiveness against the reality of trust broken. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I think forgiveness is something that happens slowly, not all at once. I think trust is something that has to be rebuilt, not just declared. But I'm willing to consider the possibility that someday, maybe, we could find our way back to being family." The conversation ended without resolution, but with something that hadn't existed between them for 3 years: the possibility of a future relationship. Thomas left that evening with a sense of hope, tempered by the understanding that redemption was a process, not a destination. Over the following months, Thomas continued his recovery program and gradually began to rebuild his life. He found work as a counselor at a rehabilitation center, using his own experience with addiction to help others navigate their own journeys toward sobriety. The work was challenging and often heartbreaking, but it gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for years. David, meanwhile, began to process his own healing journey. He continued therapy, focusing on the trauma of betrayal and the complex emotions surrounding forgiveness. He learned to separate his love for his brother from his anger about what his brother had done, understanding that both emotions could coexist without contradiction. The brothers began to have occasional phone conversations, brief and careful exchanges that slowly began to rebuild the foundation of communication between them. Thomas shared updates about his recovery, his work, and his ongoing efforts to make amends for his past behavior. David talked about his job, his students, and gradually, about his own process of healing. The first time they met in person after that initial conversation was at their grandmother's grave on the anniversary of her death. They stood side by side, each carrying flowers and their own complex mixture of grief and guilt. "I think she would want us to try to be brothers again," David said, placing his roses next to the headstone. Thomas nodded, his own flowers joining David's. "I think she would want me to spend the rest of my life making sure I never hurt anyone the way I hurt you." It was a small moment, but it represented the beginning of something that neither brother had been sure was possible: the slow, careful process of rebuilding a relationship that had been shattered by addiction and betrayal. The path forward was not easy or straightforward. There were setbacks, moments when old anger resurfaced, times when trust seemed impossible to rebuild. But both brothers had learned something valuable from their grandmother's example: that love sometimes requires patience, that forgiveness is not a single act but a daily choice, and that family bonds, while they can be broken, can sometimes be repaired with time, honesty, and unwavering commitment to growth. Thomas never stopped feeling the weight of what he had done. The inheritance he had stolen could never be returned, and the trust he had broken could never be fully restored to its original state. But he learned to channel his guilt into positive action, helping others avoid the destructive path he had taken, and working every day to become the brother David deserved. David learned that forgiveness was not about forgetting or excusing what had happened, but about choosing to move forward without carrying the poison of resentment. He discovered that healing was possible even when justice was not, and that love could coexist with boundaries and self-protection. 5 years after their grandmother's death, the brothers stood together at the dedication of a scholarship fund they had established in her memory. Neither had the inheritance she had intended to leave them, but they had something that might have been more valuable: the hard-won wisdom that comes from facing the worst in yourself and in the people you love, and choosing to keep fighting for connection despite the pain. The scholarship would help students who, like their grandmother, understood that education was a pathway to opportunity, and that sometimes the most important lessons were learned not in classrooms, but in the difficult moments when character is tested and choices reveal who we truly are. As they watched the first scholarship recipient receive her award, Thomas turned to David with tears in his eyes. "Do you think she would be proud of us for this?" David considered the question, thinking about the woman who had raised them with such love and wisdom. "I think she would be proud that we found our way back to each other," he said. "I think she would be proud that we turned our pain into something that could help someone else." The inheritance Margaret Hayes had intended to leave her grandsons was gone forever, lost to the destructive power of addiction and the betrayal of trust. But in its place, they had built something different. A relationship based not on the innocence of childhood, but on the hard-earned wisdom of adults who had faced their worst moments and chosen to grow from them. The story of Thomas's betrayal and David's forgiveness became a testament to the complex nature of family love, the devastating impact of addiction, and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. It was a reminder that while some losses can never be recovered, some relationships can be rebuilt stronger than before, and some wounds can heal in ways that leave scars, but also leave wisdom. In the end, the inheritance that mattered most was not the money their grandmother had left them, but the love she had shown them and the example she had set of how to face life's challenges with grace, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to the people who matter most. That inheritance, unlike money, could never be stolen or lost, and it continued to guide both brothers as they built their new relationship on the foundation of our honesty, accountability, and the hard-won understanding that forgiveness is not just a gift we give to others, but a gift we give to ourselves.